I thought it might be helpful to give you at least my 10 commandments for contract negotiation as you go into this contract negotiation exercise. So, first commandment, thou shalt remember who thy client is. Okay, it's tempting, especially when you're coming out of law school, to sort of be interested in trying to see a situation from all sides. And to some extent, that's helpful, right? I mean, you want to be able to put yourself in the position of the other party. But you want to go into a contract negotiation understanding who your client is, right? If you're a contractor, then you've got certain risks that you're aware of, certain things you're looking out for, certain things you don't want in a contract, certain things you do want in a contract. Owners have different interests. Architects have different interests. So you have to get clear in your own mind, kind of get it into that mindset of who your client is and be sure you're viewing whatever draft you're looking at through those lenses. Second, thou shalt read the draft with checklist in hand. Okay, it's important to understand exactly what's in that document. Now, it's also important to understand exactly what's not in that document. So a checklist, this is something that lawyers, real lawyers do. In fact, there are whole books written about checklists of issues to be looking for in reviewing contracts. And you want to have a checklist depending on what it is, what kind of contract we're talking about. For example, an owner-architect agreement, you would be looking at certain issues. For example, ownership of the instruments of service. If you're talking about an owner-contractor agreement, you'd have other issues that you're interested in looking at. For example, what's the payment mechanism? Something like that, the payment method. Are we talking about a cost plus? Are we talking about a fixed price? What are we talking about? Those are kind of the obvious ones. The more experience you get doing this, the more you add to your checklist of issues to be looking for. And this is not just looking at the language that's already there, but looking to see, is there some provision that's not there that you want to be in there in order to protect your client, right? Commandment number 1. Third, thou shalt understand what thy client wantest thou to do. Okay, different clients will have different expectations when they send you a contract to review and negotiate. Some clients will simply say, I want a red flag review. I just want you to tell me what the big issues are, or can I sign this? Okay, they don't want, or they say they don't want, a detailed examination and redraft of every provision. They just want to get the deal done. Okay, it's important to understand what the client says the client wants. Okay, that's commandment number 3. But at the same time, commandment number 4, thou shalt cover thy backside with thy client. Because if there turns out to be a problem, and the client thinks you should have caught this when you were reviewing the contract in the first place, they're not going to be interested in hearing you say, oh, well, you just wanted a red flag review, or can I sign this kind of review? They will be holding you responsible for a failure to identify some issue. So if the client says, I just want a high level review, that's fine. Just make sure that in your review you take into account the potential issues and at least flag those up to the client so the client understands, okay, I'm not looking, or I'm not trying to redraft provisions A, B, and C, although I think those are potentially problematic for these reasons, etc. So it's important to give the client what the client's looking for, right? Not more than what the client wants and is willing to pay for, right? Because especially if you're billing on an hourly basis, the client may not want to pay you 8 hours worth of work to redraft what's a relatively simple contract. But at the same time, you have to protect yourself and make it clear that, okay, you want a 30-minute review, and that's what you're prepared to pay for. Here are the big picture issues you need to be aware of, and sort of flip it back to them so that they at least know that these are some issues that they need to be aware of, and they're entering into the contract with eyes open. So 3 and 4 really go together. It's important to understand what the client wants, but it's also important to protect yourself in the event that things go south and somebody's not happy, your client's not happy about the job you did. Commandment number 5, thou shalt not agree to anything thou understandest not. Okay, this seems like an obvious thing, but especially when you're a new lawyer, a lot of language, you don't know why that's in there. Okay, and until you understand why something's in there, you better not agree to it because it may be a bad thing. Okay, don't agree to anything you don't understand. And there's nothing wrong with asking. Maybe you have to ask another lawyer in your practice, another lawyer outside your practice, whatever. Obviously, you can't disclose any confidential information. But if nobody understands what that language is, ask the other side what they meant by that language. They may not even know. So don't agree to anything you don't understand. At the same time, commandment number 6, don't propose anything you don't understand. What happens a lot of times is lawyers will cast about for language that they think ought to be in a contract, but they don't even really understand what that language means, what it was intended for. If you don't understand what the language is that you're proposing, then you're not going to be able to explain it to the other side when they ask you what it means. So don't propose anything by way of a revision to a draft if you don't understand your own language. 7, this is just a very practical point, but it's an important one. Thou shalt remove all metadata before transmitting thy draft to opposing counsel. Okay? It's not a good thing if you've received a draft, your client has made comments in the margins, you've made comments in the margins, you've got discussion going on back and forth between you and your client about, can we agree to this? Oh yeah, if they really push back, we have to agree to it, whatever. You don't want that. Okay, that's just airing your internal communications to the other side, your thought process. So you need to make sure you know how to run a metadata scrubbing program on any document that you're emailing to opposing counsel to remove all those kinds of comments and so forth. Commandment 8, thou shalt provide opposing counsel with a marked draft showing all thy changes. Okay, if you don't know how to do track changes or a red line, then you need to learn. That's a function in Word. It's pretty straightforward. A lot of firms have their own redlining program that will remove the metadata without removing the changes. And you need to get comfortable with how these software programs work in contract drafting so that you can remove the metadata, but yet still be able to show what's called a black line or a red line or a marked copy where you've struck language or inserted language when you send the draft back to opposing counsel. If you send them a clean draft that just has the language that you want, they're not going to be happy and they're going to think you're up to something. They will run their own red line and you will have lost credibility because they'll think you're trying to pull something on them. They will be able to do the comparison themselves, but you should do that for them. Typically what you'll do is after you've scrubbed the document for any metadata, you will run a black line or red line or a marked version and that shows all the changes that you made to the draft they sent you, and then you will send them both clean and marked copies of the draft so they can see what you've changed in the marked version, and a clean copy if by chance you get them on a good day and they're willing to sign what you sent without any further negotiation. You always want to make it easy for the other side to agree with you. Number 9, thou shalt know what to giveth up and what not to giveth up. Okay, not every point is worth negotiating or fighting over. It's worth having some bargaining chips, some things you're willing to give on in order to get what you really want. This is the sort of thing that you have to talk about with your client so that you know what you're giving up and what you're not giving up. You don't want to give up the store in exchange for, nothing really. So You want to make sure that you know what's worth fighting over and what's not worth fighting over. Not everything is worth fighting over. It's all a question of risk mitigation and risk allocation. You don't want to spend a lot of time fighting over something that doesn't really matter. And finally, thou shalt have all-purpose responses prepared for unexpected situations. Okay, this will happen. You send a draft over to the opposing counsel, and then they have a look at it, and they want to have a call to discuss the changes. This is very typical. It can be helpful not to have your client on that call. Why? Because then, no matter what you agree to, you can always say, I still have to run all this by the client. So you're not put on the spot. And that's a good thing. Sometimes somebody will ask you a question and you don't know the answer. For example, they may ask you, well, you inserted this language, what does it mean? And you failed to obey one of the previous commandments and you don't really know what the language means that you inserted. What do you say? You don't want to look stupid, so you have to have some sort of all-purpose response, such as, well, that's something that the client typically wants, and we'll have to get back to you on that. Something like that. Another reason not to have your client there, because you may end up looking dumb. Another all-purpose response is, well, we'll think about that. I'll talk about it with my client. When somebody asks you to agree to something and you're not sure what they're asking you to do, you can at least have a response like, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. Another good all-purpose response is when somebody proposes language that you don't really like, or you think is probably okay, but you're not sure. Maybe you don't really understand what it is that they've asked you. You can always say, I don't think the client's going to go for that, but I'll check and see if we can live with that or not, or we're going to have to just table that one. We're still talking amongst ourselves. We're going to table that one and come back to it, whatever, to buy you some time so that you don't look like you're out of your depth or out of the control of the situation. So there's some basic tips for negotiating a contract, most of which are designed to keep you from looking dumb. So you want to keep these in mind when you do your contract negotiation exercise.